Patch 13.24. This is the Vegas patch, the most important patch to ever exist in TFT's history. Why? Because this is the largest LAN event to ever exist. All right, I'm done with that. It's an important patch. You get the idea? All right, let's get into it, because that's what you're really curious about, right? You want to know about what's strong, what's something I can climb with, what is interesting, what's changed. Well, that's what I got for you here. So, first of all, in S tier, we have Fast 9. It's still strong. You know it from last patch. It's still really good here. They hit Ziggs. They nerfed him in 3 different ways. He's still really strong. And there's, of course, other options here. 5 costs are just generally quite good. So, yeah, you can still go Fast 9 and you're still going to do relatively well. But guess what is new? Superfan Viego, Akali, Karthus. I didn't have enough text to include it all here, but Viego, the buffs that they made to this unit, he's an absolute monster. He is so strong now compared to what he was before, and as a result of that, if you're able to get 3 items on Viego, 3 items on Akali, and 3 items on Karthus, you will watch as literally the opponent's board gets completely melted in seconds. It is so strong. And as a result of that, I've decided to put it in S tier. I don't know that it'll stay in S tier. This is an early preliminary thought after playing the patch for 2 days and watching a bunch of different games from other people's perspectives. But I will tell you, it feels really good. And I think people don't realize yet that you need to itemize this Viego unit. I think people are not itemizing Viego enough. I think they're prioritizing Akali because that's what they're used to. But trust me when I say Viego is a beast. Itemize him. All right, now we go into A tier. So real quickly, before we move on here, the way this is set up, anything that's in S tier and A tier, you should be playing these compositions. That's how your game should end most of the time. Anything in B tier and for fun, you should not be playing these compositions. So if you're looking ahead of me, just real quickly, I just want to mention that. KDA, Ahri, Akali, this is if you have 7 KDA with KDA Headliner on Ahri or the Akali. It's pretty strong, especially if you have KDA +1 in terms of your emblem. So then you can play Karthus as well. Otherwise, for the most part, it's a play for top 4 composition, but still pretty good. Annie Reroll, still good despite the nerfs that they made to her Superfan item. It's now a Jeweled Gauntlet instead of a Shojin. Still very solid if you have Shojin plus Nashers in particular. I'll go into more detail about the conditions under which you can play Annie, but she is good if you have those conditions met. Country Reroll, it's gone from S tier down into the A tier. The reason why it's moved down is because they did a couple of nerfs to the trait itself, as well as to the Samira Headliner. That's kind of noticeable. But if you hit 3's a crowd, the augment, you're still capable of going first. Crowd Diver Yone. This is a new composition as a result of the Yone buffs. Very strong if you're able to hit particularly Crowd Diver Headliner Yone and then 6 Crowd Diver later on in the game. If you have Crowd Diver Yone 3-star with 6 Crowd Diver, yeah, you can actually win against these Fast 9 boards or these Viego boards relatively easily. Now, Disco Dazzlers, this is the same comp as it's always been. This is your Twisted Fate composition. And if you're able to go level 9, it's pretty strong. And if you're able to find the right 5 cost, you will be able to win out some percentage of your games. If you're stuck on level 8, you're probably going bot 4. It's just how it works. Senna Reroll. This was something that was really popular at the start of the launch patch and then started to decline in popularity because it wasn't that good. And now it's back again because they buffed True Damage Akali. It's pretty good if you have a True Damage emblem. Otherwise, a little bit on the weaker side. Superfan Jazz. This has moved down from S tier into A tier. They did a bunch of nerfs here that I'll go into more detail later on, but basically they nerfed Jazz and the headliners, and that had a pretty large impact here on the performance of the composition. Now, Katarina Reroll. This is a big movement down because Katarina Reroll was arguably an S tier. At the very least, it was an A tier last patch. The reason I moved it down is they nerfed the headliner, and when I don't see a 2 cost as being very strong when it's fully maxed out, then it feels like it's not correct to play because I'm keeping myself on level 6 and level 7 for what? What's my max cap for keeping myself on level 6 and level 7? A board that still loses to Fast 9 boards anyway, or loses to some other of these A tier comps anyway? Feels like it's just not good enough, so I put it down in B tier here. And then Vertical Pentakill, this is just a worse version of the Superfan comp, where instead of playing Superfan, you're just playing a bunch of Pentakill units to guarantee that you can hit 7 Pentakill. It's just worse than playing Superfans, though. You should just play this version of the comp instead, but in some cases, you're forced to play this version, and that's okay. For fun, these are the compositions you should avoid, even though you might see other people playing them. even if you have a good spot for them, I would not play them. So first of all, we have Edgelord reroll. This is your Riven Yone reroll. If you're going to play Yone, you're playing it with Crowd Divers. Do not play it with Riven. Every single time I've seen anybody play it with Riven, they have gone bot 4. Even if they hit the Riven 3 early, this unit is just not good enough. It just isn't. Same thing with EDM reroll. You play a weaker board, and then when you finally hit the Lux 3, most of the time it's not strong enough to guarantee that you're able to top 2, top 3. So, and God forbid you play Jax reroll. That's not going to happen. That's not going to be strong enough for you. So this is for fun category. And then Punk reroll. This might come as a surprise, given that the stats on Punk reroll are pretty good. But the truth is, I've seen a challenger player hit Jinx 3 on 2-2. He had Rageblade plus Last Whisper on the Jinx. At that moment, he win streaked all the way until 4-1, 100 HP. Guess what placement he had? 7th. That was enough for me to get convinced that this Punk reroll comp unfortunately does not have enough. It does not have a high enough cap to compete against these other compositions that you see in A tier and S tier. So I'm going to go into more detail about these A tier and S tier compositions, but before I do, I want to mention that if you sub to my Twitch channel, or if you join my YouTube membership at Master Level, which is $5 a month, you will gain access to my Discord, where I post things like these tier lists early, or any thoughts I have about the patch early, or anything that I see about one tricks, a bunch of different information that I find. It's very informal and raw. So if you like the insights that I provide and you like how I think about the game and you want to see those thoughts a little bit earlier, then you'll be able to view those things and access that information on my Discord. Just a little bit of a sponsorship from myself. Now let's get into each S tier and A tier composition. Level 9 is still an S tier composition in 13.24. It's a little bit of a misnomer to call it a composition because really it's more of a philosophy. There is a lot of different variations when it comes to the level 9 board. That's why I'm starting off with just 4 units here, because these 4 units make up the core of the level 9 board the majority of the time, the front line of the level 9 board. So that's your Set, your Yorick, your Alawi, and your Thresh. Outside of these 4 units, what you add to get your damage, there's a lot of different choices here. The most common choice is the same from last patch, which is the Jazz package with Bard plus Lucian, and then you will add a Ziggs plus Sona. One note I will make about these level 9 boards is that Sona is always part of the max cap for level 9 and level 10. You need to have items for the Sona, and I'm talking about attack speed Sona. That's the blue version of Sona, not the healing version and not the damage version of Sona, but the attack speed version. That is the best performing or the highest cap that you can get. So you want to have mana gen for the Sona, Shojin being the best item, and then you want attack speed for the Sona. In an ideal world, the best 3 items for Sona are some combination of these 2 items 3 times. So you can do 2 Shojins and a Rageblade. That's the best build. You can do double Rageblade plus Shojin. You can go triple Rageblade, triple Shojin. That's the ideal build, but you can also mix in a Nashor's, a Shiv, a red buff just for the attack speed. You can also put on Adaptive Helm, for example, but really you just want this Sona to cast at least once every single fight, and even twice. If she gets to that second cast, almost nobody is going to be able to sustain the amount of damage that you put out. So Sona plus a lot of frontline is the staple for level 9 and level 10 boards. Now, outside of that, we have Bard plus Lucian for your Jazz. We have Ziggs as a duo carry in the backline here. Who else can you add to this board? Number 1 is you could add a Kiana, especially if you have Headliner or True Damage. This is probably the strongest level 9 board that exists in the game right now, right here. Outside of that, you can also look to play Caitlyn in this last slot here. So Caitlyn, believe it or not, is performing relatively well in the stats. This is a new option. This was not something that existed in 13.23. So this is very low sample size right now. But if you look at the stats for Caitlyn getting added to this board, it's very solid right now as an option. And I've actually seen it in play 2 times, and it did relatively well. So this is another option. Outside of this, you can also consider getting out of this set, and you can play, let's say, Gragas in this slot instead. And then you would add an Echo to your board, and this would give you 3 Spellweaver. This is just a cheaper option if you already have an Echo 2, for example. Maybe you don't have your Alawi 2 yet. Maybe if you don't have the Thresh here, you can also consider playing a Kiana over the Thresh. And this will give you the ability to farm items. Some other choices you have here is you can drop out of the Jazz package and you can play Kayn on your board as an item holder. One thing I will note here is that in the stats, Kayn is performing better than Ziggs as an AP item holder on level 9 and level 10. However, that's mostly because people that play Heartsteel and have big cash outs are playing Kayn on their final board, and then also because Kayn is very strong in the Crowd Diver, Qiyana, Yone, Zed comp. So if you're not playing Kayn in either one of those shells, then he's actually about equivalent to Ziggs. And personally, I think if you're playing Sona in your backline and you have a lot of frontline, I think Ziggs is better than Kayn. Based on my experience, based on what I've seen. According to the stats, though, they're relatively similar, so you can play around either one of them. So lots of different choices here for how you can play this. The main thing of note here is that you need to understand what are the 2 and 3 costs that you're going for. So that's mostly going to be your Gragas, your Echo, and your Set. Also, Lulu is another choice here. So let's say, for example, instead of playing this Echo here, we can go back into the Thresh and we can add a Lulu in the back line here. And now we have 2 more slots that we can add to our board. Let's just add the Jazz package in. And this is another option that you can look to play around. So a lot of choices here for how you can play this final board. The main idea here is you're looking to play around Sona with tons of frontline. You need to have Yorick plus Alawi. These units are very strong. Qiyana is also very strong. Sometimes you're going to end up playing that over Yorick in some instances. Ziggs and Kayn are really good AP item holders. I believe Ziggs is slightly stronger. Lucian plus Caitlyn is a package that is somewhat interesting to play around. Oh, there's another package that I forgot to mention, which is, let's say you get the Set back in, and instead of playing this Lulu here, you can play, over this Thresh, you can play Qiyana, and then you can play Senna in the backline. So if you don't have a Thresh, this is another option you can play around. There's a lot of different choices here. That's part of what makes Fast 9 so difficult. In fact, it's so difficult that I want to make a full video dedicated to it at some point. But I wanted to go through a lot of the best or most popular options here. The main thing here is that your best carries are Sona, Ziggs, Qiyana, Kayn, and Yorick. And then you should not look to play around Jhin. According to the stats, he's okay, but all of the top players tend to avoid him because he doesn't really do a lot until too late into the fight. And the problem is that you need to have Shojin or blue buff for Jhin to work. And you would just rather have those items on Sona or Ziggs, like 9 times out of 10. So most of the time, you're only playing Jhin if you don't have Ziggs/Sona as an option. That's the way I see it. Also, instead of Jhin, I've also seen Caitlyn perform relatively well. So you can go Shojin on Caitlyn until you're able to find Sona/Ziggs. So I feel like there's just better options than Jhin in general. So I would avoid that. Lots of different choices. Watch this part of the video a couple of times if you're not totally sure. This is by far the hardest line to take, but it is the best performing line in the game right now. Superfan Viego Akali Karthus triple carry is the only S tier composition that does not play around 5 cost. Now in the late game, of course, you're going to add 5 costs to your board, but the main core of the comp plays around 4 cost. Now, this is a little bit different than the way that Akali Karthus was played in the past with Superfans, which was very popular in 13.23. Now we're putting a lot more emphasis on Viego. And to really show you why it's important that you itemize Viego, I'm going to show you the stats here real quickly. So when you have these 4 units together, it averages a 3.3, but that's when you have 3 items on Viego. Let's go ahead and take the 3 items off of Viego. Let's say any item count. And look at what happens to the average here. We're going to go from 3.3 all the way up to 3.87. So that should give you an idea here that, yes, it is extremely important that you itemize the Viego. Let's go ahead and talk about how you itemize that Viego. The main thing of note here is that you need to get Edge of Night on him. Edge of Night is his most impactful item. It's not even close. There are a lot of other items that are pretty strong on him as well, but in my personal experience of playing Viego, he will dive into the center of the board, he will get the attention of people's backliners, and he will just die. He will not be able to sustain in roughly like the first 5 seconds of the fight when everybody's alive. Once people start dying, then Viego can sustain, so he kind of needs that Edge of Night to reset aggro at least once, and then he'll be able to drain tank for the rest of the fight. So Edge of Night, really high prio. It's practically I would say mandatory because it's -1 delta, meaning that on average, putting an Edge of Night on your Viego improves your average placement by 1. So instead of going 4th, you go 3rd just for this one item on Viego. Yeah, it's that important. Outside of that, you're looking to get one healing item onto him. So this can be Bloodthirster, it could be Hand of Justice, it can be Hextech Gunblade, or it can be Death's Defiance. Any of those are really solid options. And then the third item ideally wants to be some sort of damage item or utility item of some sort. So I think Steric's Gauge is the best item that you could put in this slot. There's also red buff that's very strong, but if you're playing Akali and you actually have Akali, it's a lot better on Akali than it is on Viego. So that's sort of why I don't have it there as an option. Otherwise, red buff on Viego is very strong. So if you have Viego 2 and you don't have Akali yet, then yeah, just feel free to put the red buff onto Viego and you can throw whatever other items you have onto Akali. Other than that, you also have Last Whisper as an option that you can slam onto the Viego. So this Last Whisper does not want to be on Gnar. Didn't have any room to put it anywhere else. So you can, instead of running Steric's Gauge here, you can run Last Whisper. Again, you can run that red buff in this third slot. You can run Guardbreaker in that third slot here. So lots of different options here, but personally, I think the absolute best in slot for Viego is going to be Edge of Night, healing item, Steric's Gauge. Okay, and you can really build him any way you want to as long as you get that Edge of Night on him for the most part, and some Omnivamp from somewhere. It can be from your augments as well. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then you want to itemize Akali and Karthus with any leftover melee carry items or AP carry items. And that's it. That's mainly the way that the comp gets played. Tank items go into Mordekaiser. How do you fill out the board? Well, it kind of depends on what your headliner is. So if you have, for example, Pentakill headliner and you have a Pentakill spat, then you can actually run 7 Pentakill with either Yorick if you're able to find him. Otherwise, it would just be a Kayle here. This is the strongest version of the board, and this is something that can actually contest going first, even against the Sona players. So very strong option. If you don't have the Pentakill +1 here, you can just run the Yorick anyway and just run 6 out of 5 Pentakill. It's not the end of the world. Just getting Headliner Viego is quite strong. Let's say you get Edgelord Viego instead, then you can run Kayle in this slot until you're able to find Yorick. I still think that you're probably going to run the Yorick over the Kayle eventually if you're able to find it, but this makes it a little bit stronger on level 8. Let's say you find Executioner on Akali. Then you can go ahead and either run a 5th Pentakill once you find Yorick, or you can decide to run, say, 4 Executioner here. A little bit more relevant if you have full items on Akali and Karthus, and less items on Viego. Same thing is true if you're able to find the same exact headliner traits on Karthus. So lots of different options for how you can fill out the board on level 8. The main thing to understand is this is the standard level 7 board, and then you're usually looking to add Yorick on level 8 once you find him. Otherwise, it can be any one of those other units that I listed. All right, let's talk about augments here. So I've gone ahead and I've searched all of these different things. Let me make sure I put the item count back in there because it's pretty important because it's just the better way to play this comp. So in terms of silver augments here, the main things of note here, two main things I want to note. Omnivamp is very good, so Vampirism is the best augment, of course. Harm Assist surprisingly good too because of that Omnivamp being so strong. As usual, your good combat silver augments are good, so Blistering Strikes, that's your anti-heal, Cybernetic Bulk, Uplink. But the other thing that's a little bit surprising potentially is these Econ augments are pretty good. So Spoils of War 1, even Silver Ticket, I would say less so on Silver Ticket, to be honest with you, but consistency, cutting corners, AFK, that's mainly it for the different econ augments here. But anything that helps you hit Viego 2, Akali 2, Karthus 2, and Stage 4, think of this somewhat similarly to the Fiora plus Kaisa line in set 9.5 if you played that at all. It's really just about getting into Stage 4 and being able to hit your upgrades. Now we move into the gold augments here. So for the gold augments, Vampirism, still the best augment you can get. Little Buddies, exceptionally strong. Of course, Little Buddies is always strong with any Superfan line, but given that you're playing 3 different 4-cost carries, plus you're going to be playing Yorick in the late game, as well as maybe even Alawi later on, very strong. Remember your roots, very strong if you get this on Karthus, because Akali and Viego both share a trait with Karthus. What else is interesting here? That's mainly it. The rest of these are sort of generic gold combat augments. And then lastly, we go into the prismatics here. Ignore Cruel Pact. The idea here is that you're able to play, you know, an upgraded board with Cruel Pact, but you can't go level 8 before 4-5 with Cruel Pact. So most of the time, this is not really that relevant. You have your econ augments like we saw before, so Spoils of War, March of Progress, even Tiniest Titan here, Wellness Trust. These are all econ augments. And then you have item augments that are also pretty good here. So What the Forge, turns out that Orn artifacts are pretty good on these different 4 costs. Omnivamp, of course, still very good. So Harmessus 3, pretty strong. Final Ascension, I wanted to note this one because this is not a generic combat augment that you usually play. The reason I think Final Ascension is so good here is that even though Viego has a ton of burst damage at the start of a fight, both Akali and Karthus tend to go long, especially Akali. And this will help Akali clean up anything at the end of the fight when she's sort of in that like 1v3 position that she tends to find herself in. Yeah, Final Ascension really strong for this particular composition. Other than that, just your generic prismatics. So that pretty much covers the Superfan Viego Akali Karthus comp. Very strong. The first A-tier composition I want to talk about is Country Reroll. Now, I'm going to go into a lot less detail when it comes to A-tier compositions, just because this video would go on for far too long otherwise. So I want to note that real quickly. This went down from S tier to A tier, and the reason why is because they nerfed the buffs that the Dreadsteed provides. It gives less attack speed and less Omnivamp now, and then also they nerfed Headliner Samira. Now, if you hit Country Headliner on Urgot or Samira, then you can play the full comp on level 7. It fits perfectly. If you don't hit Country on your Headliner, then you're probably going to have to level up to level 8 in order to play 5 Country. Now, another thing that's worth noting is that if you have Country Headliner and you are not able to hit Vex 3, either because you don't have enough gold or for whatever reason you're contested on Vex, then if you hit a Yorick, you can drop out of this emo package here and you can play the Pentakill package instead. So that's Karthus, Yorick, and Gnar. Okay, that will give you 4 Mosher. You still only have 2 Executioner, because just pretend this Vex doesn't exist. You still only have 2 Guardian. Again, pretend the Amumu does not exist. Otherwise, the comp fits perfectly. This is only possible if you have Country Headliner, and it's really only something you're interested in doing if, number 1, you don't think you can hit Vex 3, or maybe you hit an early Karthus 2 and feel like, all right, it's probably not worth going for the Vex 3. I can just push levels, play around this Yorick 2. So those are your 2 main options here in terms of how to fill out the board. So you have your core units here. This is your country units, and you can either fill it out with either Pentakill or Emo. Now, most of the time, it's going to be Emo. The other thing I want to note here is that if you are able to hit Vex 3, it's more important to get items on Vex 3 than it is to get on Urgot 3. In fact, Vex 3 is just a very strong carry in general. If you're able to fully itemize her, she will do a lot of work for you. So Urgot kind of gets the leftovers here. One thing I will note is that red buff on Urgot is very good, both for the utility and the damage that it provides. Now, when it comes to your augments here, the main augment I want to note is that Three's a Crowd is very busted. It's the strongest combat augment for this comp by far. In fact, it's just the strongest augment in general because you're playing 5 3-cost on your board. So this provides over 400 HP for every single unit on your board. It's completely insane. Outside of that, you're looking at econ augments. So that's Spoils of War, Infernal Contract, another Spoils of War. Let's see, Silver Tickets, Cruel Pact, Escort Quest, March of Progress. So lots of different econ augments so that you can fully hit the board. And then also item augments are quite good. So that's your Portable Forge, your Lucky Gloves, your Binary Airdrop, your Overwhelming Force. Lots of different options here, but mainly it comes down to both econ augments and item augments so that you can either hit all of your 3 stars or fully itemize all of your 3 stars. And then there's a couple of combat augments that stand out, but the biggest one is Three's a Crowd. All right, the next A-tier comp I want to talk about is Annie Reroll. I'm going to show each of the different levels, starting off with level 5. The first thing I want to note here, though, before we go into level 6, level 7, and level 8, is you need to have exactly these items on Annie. It needs to be Shojin, it needs to be Nashor's, and then your super fan item is Jeweled Gauntlet. If you do not have exactly Spear of Shojin plus Nashor's, I would not play Annie. Personally, I would not. She feels a lot weaker. In fact, she doesn't even feel that strong when you only have 2 of these items on her. So if you have Shojin plus JG or Nashor's plus JG, that's the super fan item, still doesn't feel that good. You need to have exactly these 3 items before Annie feels like she's online. Also, Emo Annie is a lot better than Spellweaver Annie. It's very awkward to fit a Mumu on your board. Most of the time, you don't want to be put in a spot where you have to put a Mumu on your board. So generally speaking here, Emo Annie, a lot better than Spellweaver Annie. So now that we got that out of the way, this is the standard level 5 board. When you level to 6, the next unit that you want to add is Seraphine or Ahri. Ahri, of course, being better, but most of the time you will not have an Ahri on level 6. One other thing I want to note here about this Annie is that you need to hit 3-star Annie by 3-5. Otherwise, you're probably going to lose too much HP in stage 3 to fully stabilize in stage 4 and 5. So Annie 3 needs to be hit by 3-5. Ideally, it's Emo Annie, and you need to have Shojin plus Nashers. So very specific conditions for playing this composition. I just want to note that if you are playing this without those specific conditions, it's more of a B tier or maybe even a C tier comp. Next up on level 7, you're going to play another Spellweaver here. So something like an Ahri is good. Something like Sona is good. And then lastly, on level 8, you're going to add your final Spellweaver, which is in this case going to be your Ahri. And then you're going to replace your Seraphine with Lulu. And this is pretty much the ideal level 8 board. And then you can start pushing level 9 and getting your, I don't know, for example, an Alawi onto the board. You can get Yorick onto the board. You can get a Ziggs onto the board. Lots of different choices here for how to fill out the board on 9. In fact, usually what happens on level 9 is you're actually just going to sell out of this Annie and play for either getting a chosen Sona or a chosen, let's see, Ziggs. Either one of those can be better options here, but you're not going to sell the Annie until you see them. So what I mean to say is you don't open sell the Annie unless you absolutely know you're going to die, unless you do so, unless you hit one of those. And that's pretty much how you play Annie Reroll. It's pretty straightforward. It's again, very strong if you have the conditions that I mentioned met. If you don't have those conditions, you really shouldn't play it most of the time. Now, when it comes to augments here, main thing of note here is that 3's a crowd, very strong, just like with the country reroll composition. That's because you're playing Nico, Echo, and Lulu. And then sometimes you're also playing a Mumu. But again, ideally you're not playing a Mumu because you have Emo Annie. So it's kind of like a throw up there. You could also play, if you have 3's a crowd and you have Emo Annie, you could also play a Mumu plus Vex, but that's a lot more awkward in terms of how you can play it. So generally speaking, I avoid that, but it is an option. Outside of that, it's all combat augments for the most part. So really, you're just looking for combat augments here. You don't need to take any, you do not need to take any econ augments to hit this Annie 3. If you need those econ augments, you're probably not going to do relatively all that well. True Damage Senna Reroll is the next A-tier composition I want to talk about. This is somewhat of a new composition for 13.24. It's not fully new. This was played in the prior patch, but it wasn't very good, so not many people played it. And this patch, it actually looks like it's relatively good, at least according to the stats. Now, the main thing of note here is I would not play this without a True Damage +1 most of the time. But if you are able to get this True Damage +1, it fits very nicely on level 7, which is great because it means you can roll for your Senna 3 on level 7 and maybe have a chance of hitting either a Kiana or you can hit your Akali 2 potentially on level 7. So you do not want to roll on level 6 when you play this. You want to ideally roll on level 7. And then the other thing of note here is that True Damage Senna is better than Rapid Fire Senna. Because if you get Rapid Fire Senna, you can still fit in 6 True Damage here. You would have to get out of this Aphelios and then you'd have to play a garbage Yasuo until eventually you're able to find Kiana. Now, once you find the Kiana, it's not that much worse, but before then, it is noticeably worse. The other thing of note here is that when we level up, the best unit we can add is Ahri most of the time. So you're going to want to move this True Damage spat over to the Ahri here. And then your level 9 is going to be Sona. Okay? So both of these boards, very strong. You have two really good options here. If you have True Damage Senna, the way you would play this level 9 board is you would drop out of the Akali here and you would play Lucian instead, ideally. So you do something like this, move your items from Akali over to the Kiana, and then you would just drop the Akali altogether. Okay, so that's the main progression from level 7 to level 9 for this comp. If you're able to get to this final board with duo carry Senna plus Ahri, or duo carry, or even trio carry with Kiana, tank items go on to Echo. You can also consider playing True Damage Lucian here as well. You can consider putting some items onto the attack speed Sona. Lots of different really solid options here, but in general, if you're able to play this with the True Damage +1, this is a very strong composition. Without the True Damage +1, I think it's a little bit on the weaker side. I've seen it bought for a ton of times in higher elo lobbies, so that's my personal assessment. Now, in terms of augments here, the True Damage augment is very strong, so this is blinged out, has really good stats. If we go and sort this by stats, Let me go ahead and make sure the minimum sample size is 100 here. You can see here that it's the second best augment right behind stationary support. And here's the thing, stationary support, if you end up playing the Ari for 3 KDA, sometimes stationary support with KDA is not very friendly. So yeah, in general here, you're looking for combat augments though. That's the main lesson to take away here. If you look through all of these top performers, it's pretty much exclusively combat augments. One thing to note here is remember your roots, pretty strong here since you're playing mostly true damage and you're going to have a Senna headliner. Pretty much all of your units get that little buff from remember your roots. So this is a new composition, or at least it's a trending composition that's not very popular from last patch, and it's performing relatively well. If you get a true damage emblem, I recommend trying this out. The next A-tier composition I want to talk about is Twisted Fate. Now, this is a very popular composition, but the truth is, in my humble opinion, this is not a level 8 comp. It's a level 9 comp, which means if you're playing it like a level 8 comp, meaning you're going to 0 every single turn trying to hit the exact level 8 board, you're probably going to go bot 4, because the truth is, if you've ever noticed, it's very difficult to fit all the units or all the traits you want to on level 8 when you're playing Twisted Fate. There's a very good reason for that. It's because it just doesn't fit that well on level 8. What I'm going to give you is a priority system, a unit priority system, so you understand the units that you should play on level 8 when you have multiple different options for what to play. And hopefully this makes your life a little bit easier for figuring out what to play until you're able to get to level 9. So the best unit you can add to this level 7 board is Ziggs, okay? Especially true if you have Dazzler Twisted Fate. Now, Dazzler Twisted Fate is better than Disco Twisted Fate and Disco Blitzcrank precisely because eventually you're going to duo carry the Ziggs. And when you duo carry with Ziggs, 4 Dazzler is a huge damage increase to your 2 carries. So Dazzler is performing much better in the stats. Of course, you're still going to take Disco Twisted Fate. You're still going to take Disco Blitzcrank. It just means you're going to end up with 3 out of 2 Dazzler on level 8. It is what it is. You have no choice, okay? So let's go ahead and show that Disco headliner. Of course, again, you're not going to be able to get to 4 Dazzler. It is what it is. You're just not going to be able to fit it on level 8. Now, the next thing is you want to play Alawi. How do you get Alawi onto this board? You drop out of the Taric. Okay, so add Alawi to your board. This is true even if you have little buddies, okay? So it's better to drop Taric than it is to drop Echo, better than it is to drop Lulu. You want to get Alawi on the board over the Taric on level 8 if you're able to find her, okay? Now, the next thing to understand here is that Taric is something you want to hold on to so that when you go level 9, you're able to get him on the board. Okay, but before then, you can drop him for Alawi. Now, let's say you don't find Alawi and you don't find Ziggs, and now you're curious, okay, what can I do to add to this board? If you have Dazzler Twisted Fate, you just add a Dazzler. So it can be a Bard, or it could be a Lux in this slot. Either one of them is perfectly okay, and you'll just play this board. With 4 Dazzler, 5 Disco, still relatively strong until you're able to find the Ziggs. If you don't have Dazzler Twisted Fate, you have a couple of other options for what to play here. You can still decide to play those Dazzlers if you want to and just play 3 out of 2 Dazzler, or you can add a frontliner to your board. So you can add a Thresh to your board, you can add a Zac to your board, you can add a Set to your board, a Nico, or an Amumu, and that will give you either Bruiser or Guardian. Now, of course, these options are much weaker than the 5-cost option, so you really want to get to that Ziggs and that Alawi as soon as possible. Again, part of why it's a level 9 board. The other thing of note here is that when you get to level 9, so let's go ahead and put all the ideal 5-cost in, all right? And we have the Taric here. And let's just go best case scenario where we have Dazzler on our Twisted Fate. We can now consider dropping out of this Lulu, which means we give up on 2 Hyper Pop, but that's fine. And then we play Sona in this slot, okay? And this is the max cap level 9 board. If you're able to hit everything that you see here, you can actually contest first place. I would even argue relatively easily unless you're fighting a very strong level 9 capped board that's playing around all of the strongest units in the game. But if you're able to have Twisted Fate, Ziggs, and Sona triple carry in the backline with Alawi, Blitzcrank, Tank in the front line, you're probably going to win most of your games. That's part of why this is an A tier, but it is very difficult to play, and most of the time you need to think of yourself as playing another board that needs to go level 9. So if you're not able to go level 9 before 5-5, you're probably going to bot 4 with this comp if you're playing it like a level 8 composition. Now, in terms of augments, there's a couple of different options here that I really want to mention. Little buddies, very, very strong. Keepers, really strong because of the way that you're positioning, because of the disco ball. Vampirism, of course, strong as always. Outside of really the little buddies plus keepers, it's really about those combat augments. And then these are just really strong econ augments in general. You can always play these, as well as item augments. The reason item augments are good is because eventually, I mentioned you're going to want to triple carry Sona, Twisted Fate, and Ziggs, and then you also want to have tank items on your Blitzcrank 2 and eventually your Alawi 2 as well. Okay, so a lot of different options here. Really, at the end of the day, I just want to emphasize that Little Buddies plus Keepers is very strong. Next up in A tier, we have Ahri plus Akali 7 KDA duo carry. Of course, you can duo carry the two of these without 7 KDA, but part of what makes this A tier is the 7 KDA. This is only possible if you have Headliner KDA with either Akali or Ahri, or if you have a emblem for KDA. And the best case scenario is you have both. If you have both, what you can do is you can drop out of this Kaisa and play Karthus. So you basically get to play Akali Karthus with an Ahri as another carry. And this is the best case scenario. Pretty strong board here, pretty cheap, pretty effective. But again, you need to hit that KDA +1 in order for it to work. And it's still not going to cap out that high. So this is unlike some of the other A tier comps that I mentioned that did have some conditions in which they win. Usually this is not going to win. This is playing for top 2 at best most of the time. Now, when it comes to your augments here, as usual, Little Buddies is completely broken. It's especially broken in this composition, because if I go back here, if you don't have this KDA +1 and you're forced to play this Kaisa, you have 4 Little Buddies that are buffing your Akali plus Ahri. The only issue here is that you're only buffing these 2 units, right? So, and even if you have the KDA +1, you're buffing up 3 units here. So it's strong regardless. Little Buddies, as usual, just one of the strongest augments in the game if you're playing around Superfan or if you're playing around any 1/2 cost in general. Of course, remember your roots, very strong because you're playing a vertical. Anytime you're playing vertical, remember your roots is going to be very strong. Outside of that, it's your standard combat augments like Inspiring Epitaph. Also, item augments with Buried Treasure, very good. So for the most part, and really it's just mostly Buried Treasure when it comes to item augments. Outside of that, it's mostly just going to be combat augments and a couple of the stronger econ augments. So for the most part here, this is sort of one of those, this is the first A tier comp that I've gone over that is really just playing for top 4, but pretty good at it if you're able to hit that KDA headliner. Superfan Jazz, you know I have to talk about it. It's moved down from S tier to A tier, still a very strong comp. I have a 30-minute video that's completely dedicated to how to play this comp, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. The main things that have changed is that they nerfed Bard and Misfortune as headliners only, but the headliner is pretty important given that you're playing Superfan. They also nerfed Jazz, and they also nerfed the best augment for the comp, That's Jazz Baby. Now, you should still take That's Jazz Baby if you are playing this line, if you're playing Misfortune Bard and exactly this board, but otherwise, it's not something that you're going to auto-take anymore. The final A tier composition I want to talk about is Crowd Diver Yone Reroll. Now, this is a composition that's gotten a lot more popular on this patch because the way you used to play Yone is you would pair it with a Riven, play 3-cost reroll, 3-star Riven, 3-star Yone, and hope you win out. Well, it turns out if you look at the stats for last patch and even this patch, that's the wrong way to play Yone. The way that Yone is getting played now is in this Crowd Diver shell. However, it's pretty situational. You need to have a Crowd Diver Yone to really make this work. If you look at Edgelord Yone or certainly Heartsteel Yone, the stats for this are a lot worse, and generally speaking, it's not easy to fit the board. There's 2 reasons for this. On level 7, Crowd Diver Yone allows you to play exactly this level 7 board, where you get to play the 2 Sentinels, 3 Pentakill, 3 Edgelord, very strong board. If you have Edgelord Yone instead, for example, now you have to drop out of the Echo in order to play your 4 Crowd Diver, or you have to drop out of the Kale to get your 4 Crowd Diver. And if you do that instead, let's go ahead and put the Echo back on the board. Now you lose out on Pentakill for your Viego and your Mordekaiser. So generally speaking, on level 7, it's a lot stronger for you to have that Crowd Diver Yone. Let's go ahead and get the Kale back in here. And then when you go to level 8, you get to drop out of Echo and you get to play 6 Crowd Diver. And this is the main cap for the board. This is the main goal of what you're trying to go for here, is that if you're able to have Yone 3 with 6 Crowd Diver, he hits hard. He does a lot of work. But if you don't have 6 Crowd Diver, the spike is not that noticeable, and you're going to fall off eventually to the level 9 boards, and you're just going to go bot 4, especially if you're fighting a stronger lobby. So you really need it to be Crowd Diver Yone. The thing is that Yone is a triple traded unit, which means that you have only a 33% chance of it being the correct headliner if it's the first Yone you see of the game. And if it's not the first Yone of the game that you see, let's say it's Edgelord or Heartsteel first, then you have to roll several times before you're going to see another Yone because of their bad luck protection. So that's one thing of note here. Yes, it will alternate through the different traits until you're eventually able to get to Crowd Diver. Although I think Leduc tested 3 traits, and it may not actually perfectly cycle when it's 3 traits. So you may not even be able to fully guarantee by the 3rd Yone that you see Crowd Diver. This is why I say that it's relatively situational, unless you're playing in the multi-talented portal. So just note that here, you really need it to be Crowd Diver Yone, which makes it pretty hard to force this. However, if you're able to get to this exact board, you're going to do very well. On level 9, you're going to add a true damage unit, your Echo here. One thing of note is that if you do have an upgraded Kiana, maybe for whatever reason you were able to find it on level 8, you're probably going to want to get that true damage sooner so you can drop out of the Mordekaiser and just play your true damage here until you're able to get to level 9 and get Pentakill back in. Because the truth is, you're probably not going to itemize Viego because he's not a Crowd Diver once you get to that 6 Crowd Diver. So one thing of note here, when I looked at the stats here, it's actually not that good to play Kayn, according to the stats, but I have seen a lot of people try Kayn, and he is relatively strong on this board, so I think there is a way to fit him in. I don't know the best way to fit him in, though. I really don't, because it's pretty awkward. If you decide to play him over Kayle, for example, then you have all melee units. It's probably over Viego a decent percentage of the time, and then maybe you can play Blitzcrank here in this over the Mordekaiser slot. So normally you'd have Mordekaiser here. You could maybe drop out of this and play Kayn instead, and then you would drop out of the Mordekaiser for Blitzcrank, and then you would play something like this as your board. This way you're not all melee units and you have a bunch of units getting stuck on each other. However, this is a new composition. Things are getting discovered for it all the time, so it's going to take time before people really figure out the best way to optimize it. Just want to note that this is something that for next week when I do the tier list, or even 2 weeks from now when it's the next patch, we're going to know a lot more in terms of what works here in terms of the max cap here. All right. Lastly here, I want to show augments. So the big thing of note here, if we sort this by average placement, is that you're looking for Omni-Vamp augments. So that's your Vampirism, as well as even Last Stand is considered an Omni-Vamp, as well as Harm Assist here. All of these things are very good. Item augments are good. So that's Caretaker's Favor. That's Idealism, Freaky Friday. And then outside of that, you're looking for your generic combat augments. And then Cruel Pact is good, of course, because you're playing 3-cost reroll. And that's all for the in-depth looks into each of the compositions. I'm not going to go into the B tier or the for fun stuff because, truth be told, you really should just learn the A tier and the S tier stuff. Everything else is, you can learn that on the fly by using meta TFT or tactic.tools, but you should have the A tier and S tier compositions in your memory somewhere. So that's the reason I'm going to go over those in a little bit more detail, because they're the ones that are important for me as well. I use my own videos as a reference source. So if you like this, again, reminder, you can sub to my Twitch channel and you will gain access to insights from me. If you have Twitch Prime, completely free to do so, and you'll be able to join my Discord and see any information that I post. Really helps me out too as a creator. Other than that, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.